Hello everybody, welcome back to Fossil Linux channel. Today we're talking about should you choose Linux Mint or LMDE Linux Mint Debian Edition. Let's give it a start. Welcome back. So today's video is about should you choose Linux Mint or LMDE Linux Mint Debian Edition, especially if you have used Windows for a long time and now because of the end of 10, you are now thinking about what should I do? Should I extend the support? If you are living in the European Union, yeah, you may have a chance to extend it for at least 1 year now. But if you live outside the European Union, then the support ended. And now you have different choices. You can extend the support by paying around about $50. You can use a free version of getting updates by using the cloud services by Microsoft 365, or you can use reward points to extend the support of Windows 10 for 1 year. You can also choose to switch to Mac OS, or if you follow my recommendation, you are switching to Linux. And if you are choosing switching to Linux, then Linux Mint could be a good choice for you. Why? But now first, let's talk about what is Linux Mint and what is LMDE. Linux Mint is the major edition of the same named project, Linux Mint. Linux Mint is based on Ubuntu LTS. Ubuntu LTS is a long-term support version that receives 5 years of updates. LMDE, on the other side, stands for Linux Mint Debian Edition, and it is based on Debian Stable. Debian Stable also receives around about 3 till 5 years LTS support, but there is a difference. The Linux Mint Edition will receive 5 years of Ubuntu LTS support, but that's only for the main Linux Mint Edition. That means, for example, 22.0. If you are switching to Linux and using Linux Mint 22.2, that's the current Linux Mint version, you won't get 5 years of support. You get 5 years of support from 2024 till 2029, no matter if you're choosing Linux Mint 22, 22.1, 22.2, or the future release 22.3. So you should keep in mind, if you are switching to Linux Mint and choosing the Linux Mint 22nd edition, then you will receive LTS support till 2029. That's the date when the Ubuntu 24.04 LTS support ends. On LMDE, now LMDE 7 is the current version, you will receive updates round about 2 till 3 years from the Linux Mint project. What does this mean? We have to split it. There's, on the one hand, you have the Debian software stack that will receive around about 4 or 3 to 5 years security updates. But you have also the parts of the Linux Mint project. They deliver the Cinnamon desktop and, of course, the X apps that are in-house apps they deliver with their distribution. Both editions are developed by the same team and they are looking almost identical. And if you are now asking why are there 2 Linux Mint editions rather looking the same or identical, there is one reason or one goal with LMDE. And the goal is to make the Linux Mint project independent from Ubuntu. Why is that? Well, Ubuntu is baked by Canonical. Canonical is the company behind Ubuntu. And Canonical makes its decision related to its business. And business is always or sometimes does not receive or does not follow the same targets or goals like the Linux Mint or like the Linux community. So that means Ubuntu or Canonical makes decisions not always enjoyable by the Linux community. For instance, several years ago, they created the Linux desktop called Ubuntu Unity. A few years later, Mark Shuttleworth, the CEO of Ubuntu and founder of Ubuntu and Canonical, decided, well, it's not serving the company goals, and they dropped Unity. And this is an example of decisions Canonical takes that are not shared or recommend or welcome at the Linux community. So Snap is another example. Snap is a software container exclusively created or baked by Canonical for Ubuntu. Previously called Snappy, now it's just Snap. On the other hand, there is Flatpak. That's a software container solution baked by Red Hat, but there is a difference. While Snap is mostly used in the Ubuntu cosmos, Flatpak is the standard service in all other distributions. So if you use Fedora, Linux Mint, also Debian or LMDE, all support Flatpak out of the box. You can install Flatpak and Snap on all distributions, no problem. I personally only use Flatpak, but that's just my decision, there's no recommendation. Now let's talk about origin and base system. The Linux Mint main edition uses Ubuntu LTS as its foundation. That means regular releases and LTS support. Regular releases means you will receive Linux Mint, for instance, 22. Some month later, the project releases Linux Mint 22.1, the first point release, followed by the second and at least by the third point release. So you have 4 releases and 3 point releases. Each point release releases the newest Cinnamon desktop plus the X apps, and sometimes a newer hardware enablement stack kernel. Ubuntu releases for its LTS branch from time to time backported kernels from the STS releases, the interim releases with a newer kernel and fresh drivers, and this kernel is backported to the LTS branch and could also then support newer hardware on the Ubuntu LTS release. Linux Mint also gets this hardware enablement stack, and by that the kernel and the drivers. LMDE uses Debian. That means conservative or more conservative. It is stable, and of course it is less customized. Debian is less customized than Ubuntu. Why is that? Debian regards itself as the universal operating system, while Ubuntu has a clear focus either server or desktop. That's the reason behind. And of course there are some differences in the base tools, systemd versions, and etc. Next, let's talk about package management and software sources. Both use apt as their package manager. That's common. Why is that? Because Ubuntu is a fork of Debian and LMDE is a fork of Debian and Linux Mint is a fork of Ubuntu. Yeah, that's how it is. Linux Mint, the Ubuntu-based edition, has access to Ubuntu PPAs and Snap if enabled. Ubuntu PPA stands for Personal Package Archive. That means a developer could create a repository, provide his software in the newest version, and as an Ubuntu user, you can add this PPA repository to your repository sources list, and with that, you could receive the newest version. So, for instance, if you use Ubuntu 24.04, the current LTS release, you have a fixed version of LibreOffice. If you want to use the newest version of LibreOffice, you could add their PPA to your system, and with sudo apt update, sudo apt upgrade, you could use or you could update the current Linux Mint version to the newest release. But there is also a risk with that, because if you use software from any developer or not a well-known developer, let's say it this way, you could also get problems in your system. You could also get malware and also viruses and also stuff like that, stuff you don't want to have in your system. So my recommendation is, do not use PPA if you have a different choice. A different choice could be use software containers like Flatpak or Snap. Use the newest version by this and not use a PPA. Why not? Because next time when you upgrade your system, it could be a very potential high that you receive issues with software dependencies, package dependencies, because sometimes this PPA-based software delivers newer libraries, and with that, and during an upgrade, you could run into errors, and that would not be my preferred choice. So if you want to have something newer, then I won't recommend you use a PPA. Instead, use either Flatpak or Snap. LMDE, on the other side, is Debian-based and has no access to Ubuntu packages PPA, but on Debian you could also use Flatpak or Snap if you want, but honestly I don't know a good reason to use Snap. I'm a Flatpak guy, I think it's clear, but you could also run snaps on your Debian system if you prefer it like that. But keep in mind, package versions in Debian are usually older but more stable. Why is that? Because Debian Stable freezes all software package releases. That means there are some exceptions like Firefox or Thunderbird. These are receiving the newest versions, but all other software packages or apps are frozen. That means no newer releases, only security updates. The Linux Mint Ubuntu-based edition follows not the same way, because Ubuntu sometimes delivers, for instance, fresh kernels by the hardware enablement stack and by that fresh drivers. On an LMDE system, you receive the Debian Stable kernel and security updates from time to time, but no newer kernels. Of course, you could use a newer kernel in LMDE. You can install it by the backported kernels, but possibly you won't receive security updates for this backported kernel because the Debian security team only provides security patches for packages in the main repository. Keep this in mind. Let's talk about stability and freshness. Linux Mint, the Ubuntu-based version, has a good balance between stability and up-to-date software. LMDE, the Debian-based edition, is very stable, but the software packages are sometimes a little bit older than the Ubuntu versions. But it also depends when you take a look on this. For instance, if we take a look now, then Linux Mint 22.2 is based on Ubuntu 24.04. LMDE 7 is the newest version, is based on Debian 13 Trixie that was released in the summer 2025, a couple of months ago. So at the current point of time, on LMDE you have newer versions and newer packages than on the Linux Mint 22.2 edition. Why is that? Because Linux Mint 22 is based on Ubuntu 24.04, released last year in April. In the past, some said LMDE receives updates less frequently and is more suitable for experienced users. I don't think this is the current state of art, because today you will receive a newer Cinnamon version on LMDE a few days after it was released on the Linux Mint main edition. So I don't think this is a real valid topic anymore. Let's talk about driver and hardware support. Linux Mint, the Ubuntu-based edition, offers a better support for newer hardware kernels and drivers. Why is that? Because Ubuntu receives the hardware enablement stack from time to time, and as Linux Mint is based on Ubuntu, it also benefits from the hardware enablement stack. This means for the users, fresh kernels and fresh drivers from time to time. On LMDE, on the other hand side, by the conservative kernel, sometimes it is less optimal for the latest hardware. Why is that? Because the kernel is frozen to the release of Debian Stable, and during the release cycle it will only receive security patches. Drivers like NVIDIA work on both, but setup is much easier on Linux Mint because you have the driver manager. This is a graphical tool. It detects your hardware and then you can switch from the open source Nuvu driver to the NVIDIA driver, reboot your system. Here we go. On Debian you have to configure it all by yourself, possibly in the terminal. I don't think this is so user-friendly, and this is the reason why the Ubuntu-based Linux Mint edition is here better for newbies than LMDE. Let's talk about performance and system requirements. Both are lightweight, especially with Cinnamon, Mate, and XFCE. But LMDE is often slightly more resource efficient since Debian comes with less overhead. But if we take a look to the system specs, you see no matter all editions have the same requirements. That means no matter if you use XFCE, Mate, or Cinnamon, all is the same. of course with LMDE and Linux Mint, the main edition. Boot times and memory consumption is more or less the same. I don't see here much difference, and on my blade I don't have such delay on LMDE or Linux Mint. Is in my opinion, it's more or less the same. So, and if you take a look at a resource usage comparison, you see it's more or less the same, no matter if you use LMDE or Linux Mint 22.2. Both has the same requirements in terms of memory, disk space, and resolution. So in this chapter there is no clear winner, it's the same. Let's talk about user-friendliness and target audience. Linux Mint, the main edition, is clearly aimed at beginners and users switching from Windows to Linux. LMDE is better suited for advanced users who prefer a Debian-based environment. But you should always keep in mind Linux Mint has more assistance. For instance, if you have special hardware on your system, with the driver management you can add proprietary drivers and reboot your system. Here we go, you're done. With LMDE, you don't have the graphical driver management, unfortunately, and this is why user-friendliness goes clear to Linux Mint and not to LMDE. The target audience is more or less also clear. If you are new to Linux, go for Linux Mint and not for LMDE. Let's talk about community and support. Linux Mint, the main edition based on Ubuntu, is the older edition. It has a large community and access to the broader Ubuntu community. LMDE, on the other side, has a smaller user base, but backed by Debian Stable ecosystem. You will also find some solutions at Debian users, for instance, but I think you will find more tutorials and help in the Ubuntu community than in the Debian community, because in my experience the Ubuntu community is bigger than the Debian community. That's the reason why. But I have a special recommendation for you. If you face some problems, just try ChatGPT or Copilot. Provide your problem, describe it, and then you will receive a solution. Sometimes this is more faster and more precisely than if you ask your question in a forum or spend time by searching in wikis for a solution. That's just my recommendation. Try AI assistant. I made very good experience with this. Next chapter, let's talk about update and upgrade policy. Linux Mint, the Ubuntu-based edition, has a simple update tool and software manager and receives regular version upgrades from time to time, delivering the freshest Cinnamon Desktop, X apps, and sometimes Ubuntu hardware enablement stack. LMDE, on the other side, also has the update manager that Linux Mint has, but it won't receive point releases like Linux Mint receives. The developers deliver the Debian point releases but do not mark them as LMDE point releases. You will also receive the newest Cinnamon versions from time to time. In the past experience, it was just a couple of days after the Linux Mint version receives the Cinnamon release. You will also get it on LMDE. So it's more or less head on head. Linux Mint and Debian both provide Flatpak and not Snap. Mint includes some Snap blocking because it is based on Ubuntu, while LMDE with its Debian base has no Snap integration. So keep this in mind. Let's talk about the pros and cons, and I will provide you my roundtable. Linux Mint Ubuntu-based edition. The pros: it is beginner-friendly. It has a very good hardware support. It has a very large community. On the cons side, it is dependent on Ubuntu and by that on Canonical. LMDE, on the other side, on the pros, it is very stable. It has fewer dependencies. It is more or less more lightweight. On the cons side, it has sometimes older software versions and fewer support resources by the community. So there we have it. Now let's come to the conclusion. Which version is right for you? And here's my recommendation. For beginners and switchers from Windows, choose Linux Mint, the Ubuntu-based edition. For advanced users and Debian fans, choose LMDE. For instance, if you are running Debian Stable with Cinnamon, then I would recommend you do not do this. Go to LMDE. you will receive a better support of Cinnamon, nice themes, and X apps, of course. Both offers with Cinnamon Desktop the same look and feel, but with a different foundation underneath. I hope you enjoyed this video. What is your choice? Let's write it in the comments, I'm curious about. If you like this video, please don't forget to give the video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell to be notified when new videos will be published. Thanks for the kind attention, ladies and gentlemen. See you soon. Bye.